I wonder about consciousness, my inner experience. I marvel about language, enabling the complexity of thought and the construction of culture, both so common in our human lives of cognition and emotion, yet both so astonishing in our universe of hot gases and cold rocks. What's the relationship between consciousness and language? Like chicken and egg? So which came first? Does it matter? To me, yes, it does matter, because I seek the deep essence of inner experience. Is language a cause of consciousness? Or the other way around, does consciousness cause language? How do consciousness and language relate? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I find the mystery of consciousness and the magic of language to have at least one fact in common. Both are taken for granted. Both seem simple and ordinary, which is precisely what they are not. Consciousness and language are usually explored separately. What can I learn by exploring them together? I ask a philosopher who has made seminal contributions to both mind and language, John Searle. John, you're known as a philosopher of consciousness, but before that, you were a philosopher of language. How do the two articulate language and consciousness?
Yeah, I didn't stop being one to start being the other. I work on both. Well, the parts of language that are most important to us are precisely those that are conscious, are consciously communicating with each other. Now, there's a whole lot of unconscious processes going on in the brain that make that possible and may enable us to form sentences and hear each other. But language is crucial for consciousness, just as consciousness is crucial for language, because much of our consciousness is shaped by language. See, here is the interesting, fascinating thought. Animals are conscious. My dogs have a kind of consciousness which is incredibly rich. They can smell things I can't smell, and they have a kind of inner life that I don't have. But all the same, there are all kinds of conscious experiences they simply cannot have. Language gives us enormous power in shaping consciousness. There are all kinds of experiences you just can't have without language. You can have basic experience like hunger and thirst and pain. But if you want to plan on how you're going to write your next book, or for that matter, feel the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism, what's your favorite? You have to have language for all of those things.
How do they work together? I mean, did one come before the other, or did they each build each other? I mean, whether we're talking about in an evolutionary sense or in a developmental sense.
I think of it from an evolutionary point of view. We don't know how language evolved, and we may never know because there's no fossil evidence. It's very fragile. But there were beasts that looked a lot like us wandering around on the surface of the earth and not talking to each other. Then there came a time when beasts that looked like us did talk to each other. What happened in between? We don't know for a fact, but we know the following had to happen. The animal had to have some way of taking its conscious experiences of perception and action and desire and belief and hopes and fears. It had to have some way of articulating those and communicating them to other beasts.
I think what you're saying is that consciousness came first, though.
Absolutely.
A rudimentary form of it.
Yeah.
Then language, maybe by evolutionary pressures, group coherence or whatever, came to develop, and that began to enrich the process of consciousness.
Yes. You get a bootstrapping effect. You start off with pre-linguistic consciousness, and you develop meaning. That's a crucial notion here. You particularly linguistic meaning and communication, and then once you've got that, you can enrich consciousness in a way that enables you to go the next step and add to your language. As you get more theories, you develop theories about how the world works, about interpersonal relations. So you get an elaborate structure of language which makes for a more elaborate structure of consciousness, which then enables you to enrich your language.
Is this a gradient, or are there potential step functions involved?
I think there have to be step functions, and a crucial step was the development of meaning, whereby human beings can get things to stand for other things. See, if I wave my arm around, it's no big deal. But if I do that as a signal to somebody, I mean for them to come, then suddenly we've got the phenomenon of meaning. It isn't just a movement now, it's a meaningful movement. Why? Because it stands for things in the world. It stands for how I want you to behave so as to change the world to match the content of my communication action.
So bodily communication, signaling, would have been prior to the verbal expression of it.
The picture that I'm trying to get across is the most fundamental is consciousness. Then consciousness expresses itself in intentional behavior, and some intentional behavior communicates to other animals. Then comes the next great step, convention. You get a procedure whereby the other animal recognizes whenever you make that gesture, there's going to be food if you do what the guy says you're supposed to do. Once you got convention and meaning, then you can get the next incredible step. And as far as I know, human beings are the only animal to do anything like this. Rich inner syntax. So now you have noises you make out of your mouth where it isn't just an undifferentiated noise like ouch or damn, but it's got a subject and it's got a verb and it refers to something and it says something about it. That's a prodigious advance because now you can say things that you can't just say with simple gestures or noises. And furthermore, you've got a capacity for generating an indefinite number of completely new things that you can say. And then once the other animals understand how these words stand for things, they can understand what you're saying because that you're saying something according to a principle of composition. The meanings of the big things, so that guy's dangerous, that meaning is made out of the meaning of the little things. That guy and dangerous. The meaning of the big unit, the sentence, is made up of the meanings of the little units, the words or the morphemes, whatever, and their combination. So you combine them in the sentences, and that's all an exercise of free will. You can combine them any way you want. The doggy cannot think there are 10,000 people at the door because he hasn't got anything rich enough. I can think that even though I know it's false.
John gives me a roadmap, explains how to read it. Primitive consciousness comes first, he says, then intention, then meaning via convention, and gestures, a primitive language that communicates meaning. Finally, the big step of rich inner syntax, which manipulates symbols and enables vast generative power. It's a compelling story, but are there other perspectives? In any event, it's an outline grounded in analytic philosophy. Can I enrich it? I meet a philosopher of mind whose perspectives are informed by her career as a novelist and her real life as a mother, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein.
Rebecca, you're a philosopher, but I'm asking you to put on your hat as a novelist as well. Language is your life, and you are conscious of your characters. So when you see the process of language and consciousness kind of working together, and step back, what do you see?
Right. I don't think that language exhausts all that there is to consciousness. Anybody who's a parent or caretaker of infants who are acquiring language, I mean, it's clear how much consciousness goes on before there is language and, and all these reactions to the environment. Actually, the first time I had a child and I watched this child acquiring language and how underdetermined it was by all the evidence being offered, I thought, it's never going to happen. How is this child ever going to acquire language, And sure enough, they do. But that is a tremendous achievement of consciousness. I tend to think there's already an innate structure that's there that explains how they're able to.
I mean, I can give an alternative explanation. I can say the things you're seeing in the child are reflexive, they're instinctive.
Oh, no, they're not.
That you are reading into what the child looks like because you're imputing your own sense of cognition. You don't buy it?
I don't, and I don't think that we really can explain the acquisition of language. They're getting input from the environment. They're hearing things and they're putting it together, and the mistakes that they make show all the inferences that are going on there. That notion to isolate from the environment this sound and then to associate. I mean, it's an amazing thing, and they are amazing creatures. Now, I do think once you acquire entire language consciousness changes.
And it gets
so it's
enriched.
really fascinating. For the second kid, when I knew it was already going to happen, all I could think about all the time was, and what is it like for you now, pre-linguistically? What is your consciousness like? But there was something that it was like for that child pre-linguistically to be was clear to me, and that's all you need to say that that child was conscious, that there was something that it was like to be it. It was having experiences. I think that very little of consciousness can be articulated. Now, me as a novelist, I have only language to work with. The modern novel is very obsessed with the question of consciousness, of trying to render the what is it like to be-ness of characters. After all, what you're trying to do is to give a sense of an alien subjectivity so that the reader can enter into it and participate in this story in some way and give up their own identity and merge it with this character. It is continuous with our capacity for what's called mind reading or theory of mind, trying to imagine our way into what it's like to be others. The powers of fiction are continuous with this, both in the writer and in the reader. But there, you're completely depending on language. That's what a novel is. And you're depending on language in order to give a sense of a different subjectivity enough so that a reader can enter into it. And so there, the consciousness is being completely made up out of language. And often when people tell me what they make of my characters, I'm shocked, I'm amazed. It's the last thing I thought of these characters. That readers are bringing their own subjectivity and projecting it into something that I created, but it's a completely different subjectivity than mine. A new consciousness is coming.
So you would say that consciousness is responsible for creating language, but when language is there, it feeds back and greatly enriches consciousness.
Exactly right. Exactly. That is exactly what I would say.
Rebecca is passionate about language in her fictional characters and in her factual children. I too remember worrying whether my children would ever learn to speak, marveling when they did, then quickly forgetting the marvel. Rebecca is sure that consciousness is more than language, distinguishing consciousness before and after acquiring language. This would make consciousness primary, not derivative, a critical distinction in seeking its deep essence. So consciousness would generate language, which in turn would enrich consciousness. It's a simple story, but is it complete? Are consciousness and language by themselves sufficient to explain their powers? Or are other concepts of mind needed, especially cognition and perception? I ask philosopher of mind, Ned Block.
Distinction that's been important is the distinction between consciousness and cognition. Cognition doesn't have to be linguistic. Those non-linguistic animals have some cognition, but then there are also animals that seem to have just perception. For example, the jumping spider can identify its prey and track it. It has a good perceptual system, but probably little or no cognition. So we can think about the distinction between perception and cognition, looking at these non-linguistic animals, and then ask ourselves, what do you have to add to perception to get conscious perception? And that's been a useful way of thinking about consciousness, I think. And the results suggest that language is really irrelevant to consciousness. It may intensify consciousness or change its mode, but is not essential to consciousness.
Could it have been the fact that language developed first and then consciousness emerged out of that in some way, or you think that's highly unlikely?
No, I think consciousness is a biological phenomenon that much predated language. We can see consciousness at its purest in perceptual consciousness, and it has little to do with language.
And how would you distinguish between the four concepts you said: consciousness, language, cognition, and perception?
Well, I think the basic distinction is between perception and cognition. We have percepts that can be conceptualized using the cognitive system. So that's, I think, the most basic distinction. And then the language is a more advanced form of cognition.
A subset?
a subset of cognition, because there's certainly non-linguistic cognition
Right.
in non-linguistic animals.
And there is no language without cognition.
Yeah, no language without cognition.
So
right,
language
yeah.
would be a subset of cognition.
Language is a subset of cognition.
And so by distinguishing each of these characterizations and stripping them out in perception, cognition, language, what are we left with in consciousness?
Okay, so we purify consciousness. It helps us to understand what it is. Perception is not linguistic in form. It's probably iconic, picture-like. And so we have to, in investigating it, we have to understand how a picture-like representation could be a conscious representation. That's also been quite useful.
The examination of each of these pieces, how important is that in ultimately trying to understand what consciousness is?
I think purifying consciousness to get the most basic core form is important, and I think this pure perceptual consciousness is probably the right form.
Ned purifies consciousness as pure perception. And while cognition and its subset language enrich consciousness, neither is needed for consciousness. But again, I worry, is the story still too simple? I worry about language. What is language anyway? I've been assuming it's a unified whole, but what if it's not? To pursue this, I go to England to ask the director of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London, Barry Smith. Barry specializes in the philosophy of taste. So for a place to examine the richness of language, he suggests a wine bar.
Barry, what can we learn about consciousness from appreciating language?
So when we have consciousness as moments of experience, we think of these as individual, unique, and yet we actually want to capture what's the same or different in our experience over time. So we don't just say, here's a visual experience of red. We want to say, these are all experiences of the same color red. So we use categories and classifications. In other words, the passing show can get assembled into larger, more meaningful groups when we use language to classify and categorize. But how do we do that? How do we connect up these bits of consciousness with something stable, which is classifying the world and not just my own experience, and which is communicable between you and me? There's something very special that we are the only creatures, the only animals who have language. And at the same time, we might be the only creatures who not only have minds, but know we have minds and can think about the contents of our own minds. Now, language, I think, is partly responsible for this way of thinking about the mind, our own and others, because when I use a sentence, when I say the euro is in decline, I'm using that to both describe a way the world might be, but also to describe the way I see the world. So notice there's a kind of duality here, that we're both describing state of affairs and describing a state of mind that is presenting the world as being in that state of affairs. So I think language has got this ability to capture the contents of the mind and talk about them and compare them with the contents of other minds.
So it seems that language then gives us the capacity to transform momentary experiences into general principles that we can relate over time, so that we build up categories and meaning from the individual experiences.
That's right, and I think the way we learn language is probably because we're coordinating our experience with others by jointly attending to the same thing. So, I mean, when you see a parent and a young child and the child's learning language, the child's looking at an object, the parent's looking at an object. They're not just happening to look at the same thing. The child goes backwards and forwards from the parent's face to the object. They're jointly attending. And by coordinating their experience, when you introduce a word, it's almost like a sound label for that experience we're both having of that object, a candle, a ball. Then taking that word away and reusing it, it can be like a commemoration or a souvenir, a sound souvenir of that experience. And using the word can recreate in our minds the original experience. That's very powerful, because now we can take that and it's portable and we can use it again and again to draw our attention, our own and others, to the same objects in the world, and in fact to objects that are no longer present. Now that breaks the connection that most animals are bound by to their present experience and environment. We're able to think about things that are not present, and we're able to compare other parts of our life with now. That's a very powerful tool.
Barry shows how language connects conscious experiences, empowering consciousness to extend beyond momentary perceptions, radically enriching its content. I see how language enriches consciousness. I see how language is not a unified whole, but what's happening in the brain. I need a neural analysis of consciousness and language, and I visit British neuroscientist Colin Blakemore.
We have a kind of language module in our brains, all set there to go. Babies acquire language very, very rapidly, including learning the rules of grammar and so on very, very rapidly. And I think we need to stand back a little bit from that and say, well, what is it that could be programmed about language? Clearly, the vocabulary couldn't be. The grammar, well, Chomsky tried for a long time to discern absolutely universal features of grammar that might be represented computationally in the structure of the brain. Maybe that could be inherited, but seems to have retreated from that position. And the commonalities now seem to be absolutely minimal between language, the really deep commonalities, and maybe could be expressed very simply. Well, I'd be prepared to concede that maybe those things are somehow built into brains. But we just have the kinds of brains that through their organization, particularly through their plasticity and their learning capacity, have this drive towards acquiring language through exposure. That's another point. If children are not exposed to language before the age of 8 or so, then they can never learn it. You've got to hear other people speaking in order to learn to speak. It's something that's acquired. And if you look at how language is organized in the brain, those classical things from Broca's area and Wernicke's area, understanding and producing language, where are they placed? Wernicke's area is in just the right place to be at the end of all the processing streams of the sensory systems. And the more we learn from imaging techniques in humans, the more it looks as though the symbolic representations within language, the categories of types of words, for instance, are related to the tail end of sensory processing change, particularly visual processing.
What would be the implications of this for the nature of consciousness?
I think there's a very intimate relationship between the high-level aspects of consciousness, and I really mean consciousness of self, and consciousness of intention, the concept that I am the helmsman of myself, carrying myself around the world, making decisions. I think that maps in a very interesting way onto the structure of language. The grammatical forms of language are very intentional in their style. There are subjects who go around doing things, acting on objects and on the world. The whole arrangement is very much a kind of almost a dualist one of an actor with intentional purposes in the world. And that's the way we conceive of ourselves. And that, of course, produces big worries for the philosophers on the one hand, the physicists on the other, thinking, well, where are the causes coming from in a device that thinks that it's controlling itself just from within? So I think it's worth pursuing the idea that our subjective interpretation of ourselves as being the helmsman of our actions is actually a sort of what I've called a meta-representation of how the brain really works. It's a false representation. We're looking at our own meta-representation. Why should we go to the trouble? Why should our brains go to the trouble of building this false representation of how we really are? I think the key is to implement and to support language. It's building a model of each individual person, which maps on to the same kinds of models that other people carry around in their head, and supports this curious form of communication, which is very much dualistically dominated in terms of intentions, that syntax, that grammar is. So it's there to support language.
So if consciousness is there to support language, but language is not selected for evolutionary process, but has come along for the ride because of other things, plasticity or whatever. What does that imply about consciousness?
Yeah, well, the same argument, that we don't come pre-programmed to be conscious, that we learn to be conscious. Anyone who's watched a child grow up, it may be very difficult to argue that a newborn baby has the same kind, depth, richness, and completion of consciousness that a 50, 60-year-old person does. Our consciousness develops and changes over time.
I don't think there's any doubt that in terms of the richness, but there seems...
So what's the relationship between consciousness and language? Here are the diverse claims. Consciousness and language are each required for the other to express its full form.
You can get the sense
Language expands the content of consciousness, while language itself is a composite of multiple modules in the brain. Consciousness exists without language. Consider babies. Perception differs from cognition. Pure consciousness is pure perception. Consciousness is a false representation of our subjective sense of self, a kind of brain magic to construct language. The general consensus is that while language is not required for consciousness, consciousness is obviously required for language, and language is required for the enrichment of consciousness. Neither consciousness nor language is simple, homogeneous, or indivisible. And while both define what it means to be human, there's more to know about each to get closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.